welcome to the CCPS Healthcare Informatics webinar series. So today's topic is enabling web scale data integration in biomedicine through linked open data and knowledge. And we have an awesome speaker with us, Dr. Molek Kamdar. He's a senior data scientist at Elsevier Health. So Dr. Malik Hamadar, in his current role, working on research and development on Elsevier Healthcare Knowledge Graph, on applications that can be powered through such a medical knowledge platform, and has also led the Elsevier standard collaborations to develop and improve upon usability of WebProtoje, which is a tool to develop ontologies. Editing platform for editing large-scale knowledge graph and subject matter expert. Dr. Muller completed his PhD in biomedical informatics from Stanford University on developing methods to retrieve, integrate, and analyze data and knowledge from multiple heterogeneous biomedical resources, and for discovering a novel association in pharmacology. Dr. Malik has won the American Medical Informatics Association 2020 Dissertation Award and Best Paper Award at multiple conferences. Dr. Malik has widely collaborated with research from several institutes on interdisciplinary projects and has published over 30 papers in different venues over the years. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Malik Hamadar. I know you are a very busy person. Thank you for sparing time for our faculty and students. And we are very excited to hear from you about the new development in your research. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, there we go. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for.
Yeah. If you guys have any question, please, we spare time at the end for 5 to 10 minutes, and they're based on like the number of questions. We usually ask to the people to turn on their mic and ask questions, and if we see a lot of questions, we usually ask to the people to type the questions, and then I ask to our speaker one by one. So we'll see at the end how it goes.
Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to present at your seminar. As was already introduced, I'm going to talk about the on the topic of like data integration, web scale data integration in biomedicine using linked open data and semantic web technologies. Just a disclosure that I am an employee of Elsevier Relics Group, but in this particular talk, I'm going to talk more about some of the current research and research and development in like semantic web technologies and linked data standards and things like that. Syed already introduced me. I'm a principal data scientist in Elsevier Health Markets. I work a lot on semantic web information retrieval, data visualization, biomedical informatics, and you can find me on my social media, and I will also share my email address at the end of the talk. So in today's agenda, I'm going to talk about I'm going to give a brief introduction on like the explosion of data and knowledge in biomedicine and how semantic web can help in that. And then I'm going to dive a bit deeper into some of the technical details into what are knowledge graphs. And then I'm going to talk about some of the biomedical applications of knowledge graphs for interlinking, accessibility, and inferencing with examples both from an academic perspective as well as from examples in clinical practice and drug development. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities while working with knowledge graphs. So starting with the first point of my agenda, There is currently a data deluge in biomedicine, and this is caused by several reasons. With the advent of the Human Genome Project and the next generation sequencing technology, there is a lot of next generation sequencing data, such as data that is coming from genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, etc. Similarly, there is a lot of patient data that is made available through the use of electronic health record systems like laboratory tests, diagnosis, administered drugs, image scans, etc. There is a lot of sensor data with the advent of the Internet of Things phenomena. So you have data collected from variables such as physiological data, other environmental data, social media streams. And similarly, there is an explosion of like other unstructured data sources, like data that is published through scientific publications, clinical trials, guidelines, as well as structured data that is available through different database creations, such as databases on drug information, biochemical pathways, epidemiology, etc. So there is an explosion of biomedical data in this particular decade. And similarly, there's an explosion of biomedical knowledge. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of this like journal, which is called Index Medicus, which had all the medical knowledge. And you can see the size in 1879 versus 1974. And there has been an exponential rise in the amount of medical knowledge that is out there going forward. And it is often said that like the medical knowledge is like supposed to be doubling every 73 days in this particular decade. Similarly, there is an explosion of biomedical literature in other domains as well. And like because of the COVID pandemic, as you can see in the screenshot from this particular paper, there is a lot of like preprints that are being published. There is a lot of like publications that are being published, and hence like it can be said that biomedical knowledge is expanding so much faster than the ability of biomedical professionals to aggregate data, aggregate knowledge, assimilate the knowledge, and apply that knowledge effectively. And this is true for like education, biomedical research, as well as like patient care. And there is this lot of difficulties when like trying to interact with like biomedical data and knowledge. A lot of that is stored in like disparate like databases and knowledge bases with unstructured formats and schemas, with minimal interlinking. So biomedical researchers often find a lot of difficulty trying to integrate data from multiple data and knowledge from multiple heterogeneous sources simultaneously, and then use that integrated data and knowledge into their own applications. So here is a cartoon representation of this like walled garden where different sources are often not interconnecting with each other. It's often difficult to integrate those sources. So that is where the vision of the semantic web comes into picture. And for those of you who are not familiar in the audience, the semantic web was a vision to make data more machine readable on the web, which would lead to the creation of this web of data, which coexists with the current web of documents. And there are a lot of standards that have been established by the World Wide Web, World Wide Web Consortium, that allow the representation of data and knowledge on the semantic web. And so you can represent different concepts. You can represent relationship between the concepts. You can represent categorization of the different concepts and relations, which ends up creating this like linked graph of data and knowledge, which in these days is called knowledge graphs. And we are going to go a bit more into some of the technical definitions of the knowledge graph. So in the later slides. And one of the benefits, apart from making the web be a web more machine readable, is that this embedded semantics can enable web scale integration, reasoning, analysis of heterogeneous biomedical data and knowledge sources. And if you follow the Gardner Hype cycle, knowledge graphs or the semantic web is considered to be a very hot topic. It's included in the top of this, like as you can see, of this like hype cycle for innovation in artificial intelligence in 2021. So what this talk is going to talk about is like not only giving technical details about knowledge graphs, but also how we can use knowledge graphs and semantic web technologies in biomedicine. What are some of the opportunities, and then trying to demystifying the hype and to make you aware of the challenges that are associated with using some of the semantic web technologies. So I will talk a bit about some of the technical details behind knowledge graphs. So and this definition is generated from sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, sorry. This definition is generated from this particular paper, and by knowledge graph, a knowledge graph is a graph of data that is intended to represent the knowledge of the real world. So the nodes in this knowledge graph represent entities of interest, and edges represent the relations between these entities. So you can see on the example, rheumatoid arthritis is an entity, and methotrexate is an entity, and there is a relationship between rheumatoid arthritis and methotrexate. And you can categorize the relation to be of type has drug. Similarly, other nodes as nodes in the knowledge graph can also be classified into different semantic types. So you can indicate that rheumatoid arthritis is a disease and methotrexate is a drug. And so the schema defines a high-level structure of the knowledge graph, and you can have different ontological characteristics that manifest in the knowledge graph using the schema definition. So, for example, you can indicate that Felty syndrome is a type of rheumatoid arthritis, and it inherits all the properties associated with rheumatoid arthritis. There are other ontological characteristics like inheritance, symmetry, transitivity, cardinality, etc., that can also be expressed in a knowledge graph. Similarly, you can associate additional metadata that can be associated and nodes and the edges in a knowledge graph. So, for example, you have the relation between rheumatoid arthritis has drug methotrexate. You can indicate that this relation is expressed in this particular clinical guideline. And finally, this knowledge can be extracted or integrated from multiple different and often heterogeneous sources. And so the definition of a knowledge graph remains contentious, and like different people have different definitions of what is a knowledge graph. And for me, I generally refer to this one from the paper linked here. But you might be wondering, wait a minute, this sounds all very similar. So, and you are actually right. Like, so biomedical AI has been here before in the 1980s. So around like 1970 to 1985, there was a substantial investment by the National Institute of Health, or NIH, and industry for developing semantic networks and knowledge-based systems in biomedicine. One of the popular semantic knowledge-based expert system was the Mycene expert system, but there were Mycene, Internist One, Athena, etc., which were developed, which used the semantic network-based representation. The difficulty back then was that it's very difficult to express all the clinical rules formally to build such a semantic network, and it often involves interpreting the mental model of a domain expert. And as a result, a lack of delivery of the promises of experts' knowledge-based expert systems led to an AI winter. So, what is the historical context of the current enthusiasm? Google released the Google Knowledge Graph publicly in May 2012, and they mentioned that this knowledge graph is the one that enhances the user search and discovery experience. And well, if you might be familiar with the Google search interface, if you search for something, you get this nice knowledge panel, and that knowledge panel is actually being generated from the knowledge graph. Over the last decade, several academic labs, companies such as Microsoft, IBM, even Elsevier, and even the government has like publicly launched their own knowledge graph since 2012. And you might be wondering, if you are in an academic background, how do I use those knowledge graphs if I'm not working like in an industry sector? Well, there is simultaneously this web of linked open data. And in the web of linked open data, there has been a lot of development by representing all the publicly available heterogeneous data sources and knowledge sources on the web in the linked graph format. So from May 2007, when the web of linked open data was first like conceptualized, there were only 12 such data sources which were represented in this linked data fashion. And then in May 2021, in the current time period, there are more than 1,300 sources which are represented as RDF linked data graphs, or are made available for querying using like Sparkle endpoints. And all of these are semantic web technologies that I am going to talk a bit more about in the future. What I'm more interested is, as I mentioned, the life sciences region or the biomedical region of the linked open data cloud. So there are a lot of sources that are available that are made available as linked data graphs on this linked open data cloud. These sources include sources around drug information like drug bank, pathway information like Reactome or the Kyoto Encyclopedia of Genes and Genomes, chemical information like Campbell or PubChem, protein information like Protein Data Bank or UniProt, and similarly a lot of different medical terminologies which are also used in electronic health record systems and other applications. So there is a lot of knowledge and data that is available that is represented using semantic web and linked data standards that is available on the linked open data web. So you might be wondering, like that while there is been a lot of interest since the 1970s for semantic representations, why are knowledge graphs different now? Why is there so much hype associated with that? So one of the major reasons is around the maturity of the tools, technologies, and methods that are used to make knowledge graphs available on the web and make them available for querying and use in other applications. And so there are several different graph database vendors that are available. And here I would like to make a distinction from property graphs versus like the semantic web-based knowledge graphs that I mentioned. So property graphs are a different way of creating knowledge graphs. And so there are some property graph databases like Neo4j, memgraph, Oracle property graph, etc. That create this like property graphs. And they're also often considered knowledge graphs. However, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be focused around knowledge graphs that are created using semantic web technologies and linked data standards like RDF and things like that. And for that also, there are a lot of scalable graph database vendors available, such as GraphDB, Stardog, Amazon Neptune, Blazegraph, etc. Another major reason is the advent of next generation natural language processing and machine learning and deep learning methods and scalable processing technologies. So as I mentioned before, one of the major reasons why in the 1970s and the 1980s, semantic networks and knowledge-based expert systems failed was the difficulty in representing all the rules formally and acquiring new and new knowledge. However, with the advent of this next generation methods, there is like a lot of improvement for knowledge acquisition. So a lot of times you might not need to define the different rules in a knowledge graph by yourself manually. And knowledge graphs often serve as bridges between knowledge and applications, and also between this connectionist AI and symbolic AI. So you can create new and new relation. You can identify new concepts using these machine learning methods, which are often like connectionist based AI based methods, and then you can use the knowledge in a knowledge graph using the symbolic AI or rule based applications, because oftentimes applications need to provide some transparency and some provenance on how a particular application comes to a particular decision. So knowledge graphs often serve as a bridge between the connectionist AI and the symbolic AI. And knowledge graphs are also often used, as I mentioned, like for explainable AI methods to provide justifications on why a given clinical decision was provided or how a particular search behaved in a particular way. And so there is a huge ecosystem of that surrounds the knowledge graph. The knowledge graph by itself is not just a graph database. So when a new knowledge graph is created, the first step is obviously to identify new sources of knowledge. So this can be either knowledge that is stored in a human readable form, in an unstructured form, in clinical guidelines, medical textbooks, scientific publications, so on and so forth, but also in structured form like in databases. And this can also be knowledge that is extracted from images. You can have a lot of different knowledge extraction and integration methods. You can have your machine learning methods, your natural language processing methods, deep learning methods, and as well as like extract, transform, load, or ETL pipelines that extract new knowledge from all those different sources and store it in a knowledge graph. And finally, because we are talking about knowledge graphs which are used in biomedicine, so oftentimes the knowledge that is stored in a knowledge graph needs to be trustworthy, it needs to be updated, it needs to be accurate. So you often need exploration and curation interfaces on top of your knowledge graph where subject matter experts, so biomedical experts who are familiar with the biomedical knowledge, can go in and curate the knowledge graph. And finally, knowledge in a knowledge graph can be used in several different applications. And these applications can also use contextual data or user data or patient data that is often stored separately from a knowledge graph in the secure silos due to several different regulations like HIPAA regulations, so on and so forth. And this is an iterative process. So depending on your application and the requirements of your application, you might always want to go revisit and identify new sources of knowledge that need to be also processed in your knowledge extraction and integration pipelines and need to be stored in your knowledge graph and made available through application. And so for all of these different components in this ecosystem, there are several different tools, technologies, and methods that are available for creating the knowledge graph. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are several languages and standards that have been developed both academically and from an enterprise perspective to represent and query the data in and out of a knowledge graph. You have your resource description framework, your web ontology language, shape expression language, your default XML format, JSON LD, Neo4j has its own custom representation, so on and so forth. Similarly, there are a lot of standards and languages around querying a knowledge graph. So you've got your Sparkle and GraphQL APIs. You can also have Cypher or Gremlin APIs, which are widely used for property graphs. And similarly, you can always develop custom API interfaces on top of your knowledge graph to serve projections out of your knowledge graph. And finally, as I mentioned, this is an ecosystem. There are a lot of complementary technologies that are available for automated ingestion, indexing, visualization, and curation of a knowledge graph. So you've got your visualization softwares like Cytoscape, Gaphy, your curation interface like Protege. You have got indexing pipelines like Solr, ingestion pipelines like Airflow, so on and so forth. And similarly, there are a lot of machine learning and NLP methods that are available to extract knowledge that is available in a human readable form in unstructured data and make it available in your knowledge graph. So obviously you start with your supervised method, but it's often difficult to get manually curated data. So these days there is a lot of emphasis on like unsupervised knowledge extraction or semi-supervised or weakly supervised methods for knowledge extraction. But a simplistic example here, and it's a very general example, is that if you have got a statement in your medical textbook that conjunctivitis is the most common cause of red eye, you can have a knowledge extraction method that extracts a structured triple that conjunctivitis has clinical finding red eye. And this structured triple can then go in your knowledge graph along with the rest of other triples, maybe with some associated confidence score on how accurately is that particular triple represented in a given sentence. So there was a very whirlwind of like some of the technicalities behind knowledge graphs. In the next section, I'm going to talk about some of the biomedical applications of knowledge graphs and focus more both from an academic perspective in the domains of like interlinking, accessibility, and inferencing, but also from actual examples in clinical practice and drug development. So starting first of how knowledge graphs can help interlinking of entities for data integration in biomedical applications. I'm going to take a small pause so that you can read this particular comic. So this is a very popular XKCD comic, but it is also true in biomedicine because there are a lot of different clinical standards, terminologies, vocabularies, biomedical databases, and knowledge bases, which often use their own entity notations with minimal reuse across these different notations and minimal interlinking between the notations. So you got you might have drug information present in PharmGKB, RxNom, Drug Bank, comparative toxicogenomic database, so on and so forth. But all of these might use completely different entity notations to represent the same drug across the different sources. And so one of the topics that that we faced this issue was around was related to the opioid abuse epidemic. So opioid abuse epidemic is one of the most challenging public health challenges, and it's often indicated that modifying the current prescription strategies is practices is an important strategy to tackle this epidemic. And there is an increased prescription of opioid medications, which often lead to widespread misuse of both prescription and non-prescription opioids. So we were approached when I was at Stanford. We were approached with this problem um, uh, around drug string normalization. So we worked with this non-profit organization called Foundation for Precision Medicine, where they had an EMR data warehouse where data was aggregated from more than 400 centers across 42 states from 2009 to 2016. And so they wanted to develop summarization, visualization dashboards, and statistical models to gain a better understanding on the opioid prescription trends across the US and to predict possible opioid abuse behavior, risk factors, and adverse outcomes in patients. However, since the data was collected from so many different centers, from different states, from several different time periods, there was no normalization across the drugs that were used to represent the data in this huge data warehouse. And in many cases, drugs were just represented as strings. So what we came up was with this approach to develop this opioid drug knowledge graph, which consisted of several different terminologies and primarily drugs that are associated with like opioid drug categories. And using this opioid drug knowledge graph, we developed this visualization dashboard where you can get an understanding of the opioid prescription trends in different states, as well as you can visualize down to the county level opioid prescription across different categories, across different time periods. So this was possible to be finished. This project was possible to be finished in a very short time period of less than 3 months, only because we used some of the semantic web technologies and linked data standards to create this opioid drug knowledge graph, rather than directly going into that EMR data warehouse and trying to manually correct all the drug strings and getting them into a common standard. And so another use case is accessibility of knowledge to get a complete picture in biomedicine. And once again, I'm going to pause for a brief minute here so that you get to read this particular comic. So this comic is about is inspired from this story about 6 blind men and an elephant. So these blind individuals are looking at different parts of an elephant and thinking that it's a spear or a rope or pillar or wall. But to understand that it's an actual organism, it's an elephant, like you need to get a complete picture. And so this is also true in medicine, where it is often necessary to get a complete picture of a disease for patient care, clinical research, education. And for this particular case, you need to aggregate updated, trustworthy, accurate, and contextualized medical knowledge about diseases, drugs, pathways, phenotypes, demographic information, social determinants of health, etc. And this knowledge can exist from several different sources like medical textbook, structured databases, images, so on and so forth. And this has been more true in the case of like the COVID-19 pandemic. So you must already be tired of hearing about the COVID-19 pandemic, but I'll just like briefly recap that it has caused significant health burdens worldwide with more than 5 million deaths, 375 million cases, 2 million cases that are added daily, and it has a complex disease pathophysiology and several different variants. And so while the pandemic was raging on, there was also been an exponential rise of clinical and scientific literature around the diagnosis, prognosis, treatment of this disease, along with other facets of this disease and coronaviruses in general. Similarly, there has been a lot of open data sets that have been published pertaining to COVID-19 that have been added to scientific and clinical domains. So how does knowledge graphs come into this picture? Well, you must be familiar with the Wikidata knowledge graph. It's an open multilingual knowledge graph that can be read and edited by both humans and machines, and it is often considered to be the backbone of several Wikimedia projects, including Wikipedia, which you might have used. And so when the COVID-19 pandemic started out, a lot of Wikidata researchers started developing this COVID-19 representation model in Wikidata, and then developed information extraction pipelines that can extract information from clinical publications and represent within Wikidata, which can then be used by several projects. And so over the last 2 years, there is this aggregated knowledge of COVID-19 in Wikidata is used to develop interactive dashboards for demographic surveillance and curate biochemical pathways to understand disease pathophysiology, which is very exciting, and it's a real-world application of the Wikidata knowledge graph used to tackle a complex challenge in biomedicine. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about how knowledge graphs can help infer new knowledge in biomedical applications. So knowledge graphs can be used for both logical and statistical inference. Here is a trivial example about like what do I mean by inference. For example, you've got this like small snippet about knowledge graph where you have fluorocells that may cause fluorosil-associated diarrhea, which is a type of diarrhea, and diarrhea is a risk factor for dehydration, which further is a risk factor for acute kidney injury. So you can automatically infer, given some of the ontological characteristics of a knowledge graph, that fluorosil-associated diarrhea may also be a risk factor for dehydration. And because it is maybe if the risk factor property is transitive, you can infer that fluorosil-associated diarrhea is also a risk factor for acute kidney injury. Similarly, you can have rules such as like identify patients that are at an increased risk of acute kidney injury, and you can define this rule. That is, this rule identifies patients that exhibit any clinical finding that are a risk factor for the acute kidney injury. So in this case, like any patient with fluorosil-associated diarrhea or diarrhea may be tagged to be at an increased risk. Similarly, you can have statistical inference using a knowledge graph. So this is an application, once again, from my graduate school days that where we developed this huge systems pharmacology knowledge graph. And the reason why we did this was because polypharmacy and drug-drug interactions lead to hospitalization of and serious injury of more than 2 million individuals in the US, with 100,000 deaths annually. And these drug-drug interactions are often preventable, but it's often not known because like when a patient is prescribed on multiple drugs, these drugs may interact in a patient body through several different biological mechanisms. And the knowledge that defines this biological mechanism often resides in several different sources on the web. So what we developed was the systems pharmacology network that was composed of drugs, proteins, enzymes, pathways, and phenotypes. And we used this knowledge graph for signal detection over the US FDA adverse event reporting system datasets. What we were able to show is that while such a knowledge graph has like almost a similar performance compared to like existing methods for signal detection, you can also get like possible hypothesis for what are the possible biological mechanisms through which two drugs may or may not interact with each other that may lead to causing an adverse reaction. And you might be wondering that we have talked a lot about some of these like academic examples, but how are knowledge graphs actually used in practice in the real world? And that is a valid point, but like knowledge graphs are used widely across by several different companies in biomedicine. And this is only a small representative examples of some of the open papers and articles that I found about how knowledge graphs are used for, say, for example, clinical search, where you want to retrieve information from heterogeneous clinical literature, context-based search, where you want to provide relevant information to the clinician at the point of care in an electronic health record system, clinical language interpretations. So for example, in chat systems and speech assistants, you might want to interpret the everyday user terminology, which might vary from the clinical terminology that is used by medical providers. And there are a lot of also use cases in the pharma industry for drug target identification, drug discovery, drug repurposing, drug safety, as well as integrated analysis of omics and clinical trials data. The links are present here, and there's a lot of material out there that is publicly available, and I hope that this gets you excited about how knowledge graphs are actually used in the real world by a lot of different academic labs, industries, companies, government, etc. So in my final part of this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about getting ahead of the hype, as well as trying to understand what are the challenges associated with working with semantic web technologies, linked data standards, knowledge graphs, etc. So once again, I'm going to revisit the knowledge graph ecosystem that I talked about previously, where you have got different methods to extract and integrate medical knowledge, which can then be biomedical knowledge, which can then be stored in your knowledge graph. There are exploration and curation interfaces, and then that knowledge can also be used in applications. So when you're developing or working with a biomedical knowledge graph platform, there are three metrics that you must always be aware of. So the first is around freshness. Is the biomedical knowledge in the knowledge graph up to date? Biomedical knowledge is continuously evolving and expanding with new research and discoveries. So if you are developing a biomedical knowledge graph or using a knowledge graph in your own applications, you might want to make sure that the biomedical knowledge is fresh and up to date. Similarly, because you are using biomedical knowledge in biomedical application, you must the knowledge must be trustworthy and accurate. So you must always ensure whether correctness, whether the knowledge graph is correct and the knowledge in the knowledge graph is accurate. And finally, as I mentioned before, biomedical knowledge can arise from several different sources. That can be disease knowledge pertaining to certain diseases, drug information, biochemical pathways, demographic information, social determinants of health, so on and so forth. So there needs to be some kind of like a completeness metric to ensure that all the required knowledge that you use in your knowledge graph is actually captured and represented in your biomedical knowledge graph platform. And these three metrics are often in conflict with each other. But there are obviously opportunities where around each of this particular metric. So to ensure completeness of your knowledge graph, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of domain-specific machine learning and NLP approaches that extract biomedical literature, biomedical knowledge from unstructured literature and represent it in the knowledge graph. Similarly, you can develop automated build and deployment cycle to ensure quicker releases and ensure that the most updated biomedical knowledge is distributed to your products that are powered using the knowledge graph. And finally, it's often like very difficult, but like I always like to emphasize that when you're talking about a biomedical knowledge graph platform, it is often important that you ensure that there is some kind of like a manual curation or a manual validation by subject matter experts as well. And to do that, you can use some interactive user interfaces so that you can ensure that the biomedical knowledge in the graph is correct and trustworthy. But there are a few more challenges that I wanted to walk through if you, whether you are developing your own knowledge graph or you are using some of the publicly available knowledge graphs on the linked open data cloud in biomedicine. And there is no free lunch, obviously. So the first challenge is about knowledge extraction. So medical language is very complex, and there might be statements in the medical textbook or a guideline that can indicate speculation, negation, context. So for example, context around a particular age group or an ethnicity or multiple entities. So these are actually valid examples from clinical textbooks. So let us walk through some of those examples. So the first example is the statement that status asthmaticus or acute severe asthma is a refractory state that does not respond to standard therapy, such as inhaled beta agonist or subcutaneous epinephrine. Given this particular statement in a medical textbook, can you infer that acute severe asthma has drug maybe not. I mean, definitely it's a form, it's still but studies have only shown a weak association. Can you infer the triple breast cancer has drug recepin? I don't think so, and most of the subject matter experts would say that this particular relation is not expressed in this particular statement. However, it's often thrown some machine learning pipelines, like existing machine learning tools for relation extraction, into difficulty. So there are a lot of challenges with knowledge extraction. One possible solution is that you can associate your provenance and confidence metrics directly within the knowledge graph, and then you can use it for querying. So depending on your application, you can either threshold on your confidence metric, or you can combine triples with varying confidence metrics. So you can combine the triple of asthma has drug epinephrine, and you can look at like all the statements where this particular relation may or may not be expressed, and you can develop some confidence combined confidence score on top of that particular triple. So there are solutions that are available for that, but it's still very difficult for taking and just like a state-of-the-art machine learning method and using it for knowledge extraction. Another challenge is around like modeling and representation of temporal and probabilistic data, which is still very difficult and complicated using semantic web and linked data standards. So here is an example of that this patient has a heart rate of 100 beats per minute, but this heart rate is measured on a given date at a given time by a given device with a given accuracy. So how do you represent all those other metrics like the date, time, the device, as well as the accuracy measure, along with the triple that John Doe has a heart rate of 100 beats per minute? There are solutions, but nothing. But there's still like debate around that. Obviously, reification has been widely used, or using property graphs for this particular for tackling this challenge. But there are new standards that are being released right now, such as RDF star or Sparkle star, which make the task less verbose and cumbersome. Similarly, if you are using publicly available knowledge graphs on the life sciences linked open data web, there's also challenges about where should I begin with, like which sources should I query, how should I query the public linked open data web for knowledge on biomedical entities. And one thing to make sure, and this was some interesting finding that we found, is that knowledge about enzymes and phenotypes can be present in several different sources using completely different schema elements or ontology standards. So it makes it very difficult to combine knowledge from all the different sources on enzymes and phenotypes. There are solutions here once again, but it's still challenging. So there's like you can have monitoring frameworks which monitors the availability of different sources on the linked open data web. You have preservation frameworks which take snapshots of different sources and puts it in a registry such as LOD Laundromat. Similarly, if you use an existing knowledge graph, you can also ensure that it has strong community support. So support can, for example, Wikidata, which has a strong community support and several developers working who can help you out understand the knowledge graph. And there are other novel data discovery frameworks that can like scroll across the linked open data web and look at the different schema elements that are present in the web. But it's still very challenging to like to start working on this linked open data web. And finally, once again, the publicly available life sciences linked open data web has a lot of different sources, and there is a lot of widespread semantic heterogeneity. So for example, the way a particular drug is mentioned or a way a particular drug interaction is mentioned be completely using completely different schema elements and things. So the Sparkle queries that are often required to retrieve the information from publicly available LSLOD web can be exceedingly complex. And so in the yellow example that you see here, we actually looked at like what would it take to aggregate all the drug protein interaction information from 4 different sources, and the resultant Sparkle query is this huge convoluted query, which is very often difficult for subject matter experts or even experienced computer science users to formulate. So summarizing some of the challenges that we talked about, I also wanted to highlight that there are some more challenges like the privacy and the security of patient data when working with patient data in conjunction with your knowledge graph, or just the socio-technological challenges, because you might be dealing with multiple different stakeholders that are involved to develop, use, and adopt knowledge graphs in their own biomedical applications. So there are a lot of socio-technological challenges that are associated with dealing with multiple stakeholders. But I hope that I have not tried to scare you away with like some of the challenges that I mentioned in my last part of my presentation. I still strongly believe that semantic web technologies and knowledge graphs provide unique opportunities for web scale computation, integration, retrieval over heterogeneous biomedical data and knowledge sources. And if you remember, I did talk about several use cases in biomedicine for clinical search, polypharmacy, drug discovery, prediction models. And one thing is for sure is that knowledge graphs are going to be involved in driving biomedical AI innovation in the 21st century. And there are some challenges, but there is also a lot of opportunities for research around those challenges. So with that, I would like to end my talk, and I am open for questions.
Thank you so much. So audience, if you have any question, please, you can open up your mic and ask to our speaker. Or you can type if you want. Okay, so one question on my side, by the time the audience are typing, so you see the trust, like getting building a trustworthy application, especially like in the machine learning and deep learning. At this time, the knowledge graph is being used just like in the form of the explainable AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see, and I mean, what could be the future? I mean, would the knowledge graph embedding or combining the knowledge graph with the conventional machine learning, deep learning technology would able to win the trust of the doctors or the like the people in the healthcare? I mean, at this time, that's the big challenge. I mean, when you like you have the X-ray, like and it's you feed into your algorithm, it says that the person have a COVID, and I mean, how we can check like there is no at this time, it's a black box, input and
Mm-hmm.
output. So that's where the knowledge graph is being used. But how do you see the future?
That's a good question. So yeah, one benefit of knowledge graphs has been, and even back in the 1970s and the 80s, was like providing like justifications on why a particular clinical decision was reached, or like what was the thinking by the machine to reach to get a particular search result and things like that. So knowledge graphs were somewhat more effective in that aspect compared to like the current methods for like machine learning and deep learning, which a lot of clinicians still uh, they still think, and like justifiably, like they think that they are like more like boxes where you cannot justify why you gave a particular why you reached to a particular decision. What was your understanding behind like the diagnosis of a given treatment, or coming to diagnosis of a given patient, or coming to a given treatment decision. So where I see knowledge graphs coexisting with like some of the machine learning and deep learning methods is that you can have machine learning methods and deep learning methods to like populate your knowledge graph of using like relation extraction or identification of new concepts in your knowledge graph, and then you can use the knowledge graph in the application directly using some of the symbolic rules based methods, right? So that you can also provide like justification on why a given decision was reached. And because and the way to use the knowledge in your to use the knowledge that is stored in your knowledge graph in all those applications, you can use some kind of like thresholding or heuristic standards, such as like weighted measures depending on which source is the knowledge being extracted from, or like how much accurate was the machine learning pipeline when extracting a given triple from a knowledge graph, for a particular knowledge graph. And you can use all those confidence and provenance metrics to come up with a weighted score for each relation in your knowledge graph. And then another point that I wanted to emphasize once again is that you always like if you want to use your knowledge graph in, say, a clinical decision support system, like even though the relations in the knowledge graph are being extracted using machine learning pipeline, you can have subject matter experts who can use some of the interactive like user interface tools to like actually go into the knowledge graph and validate some of the triples manually, so that your knowledge in the graph is trustworthy, and then the clinical decision support or the clinical search application or any other biomedical application gets like the most relevant knowledge and most trustworthy knowledge.
I see. Thank you. So yes, Dr. Kistkar, please
All
go
right.
ahead.
Thank you for the interesting presentation, Dr. Kamkar. I have a question, mostly maybe is general. As you know, recently they use a knowledge graph for explainable AI. So, do you know how we can use this knowledge graph for toward your research that you did so far? How we can use it?
So the knowledge in the which example
I'm talking in general. The knowledge graph they usually use for mostly for explainable AI to explain, for example, about the AI system. I said maybe if you can explain a little bit about the knowledge graph that you're using in this biomedicine data, how you can, for example, use knowledge graph to explain that situation in your system.
Gotcha. It depends on like which system you are using your knowledge, you are using the knowledge graph in, right? Like, so there's been a lot of like knowledge-based systems in the past, and some of them are also like the rule-based systems are often used in like clinical calculators and like clinical decision support systems. So like I did mention about
Still,
like
I'm considering your system that you just present today.
this one.
Like the polypharmacy?
Yes, in this one.
Okay, this one, yeah, so in this particular system, so what we did was like we used this for like signal detection in the FDA adverse event reporting system. So like we looked at like the drug interactions, like which two drugs may or may not interact, and the adverse reaction that may manifest on account of it. But you can also combine, you can also do polypharmacy where like it's like more than two drugs, right? So like you can have 3 drugs, 4 drugs, because a lot of patients are prescribed multiple drugs. A lot of them are like on this like drug cocktails. So the ability to do signal detection over a combination of different drugs as well as the adverse reaction. So what we ended up using was this, if I remember, yeah. So what we ended up using was the hidden conditional random field model, as well as another a graph-based model to like determine like such signals where like 2 or more drugs may be interacting with each other, and the adverse reaction that may occur on the account of those interactions. The benefit of this knowledge graph, while it showed like almost equivalent performance to existing signal detection methods like the gamma Poisson shrinkage or the Bayesian confidence propagation neural network, so BCPNN, which are widely used for signal detection in the FDA adverse event reporting system. What we saw was that we can also try to provide justifications, like why are the set of drugs interacting? Like, are they targeting the same protein? Are they targeting proteins that are present in the same pathway? Is one of the drug targeting the enzyme that is used to metabolize another drug? These are all just like hypotheses, right? Like, so it's definitely, we did not test this in like in a clinical setting, like by subject matter experts and things. So as I mentioned, this was an academic example. But
Yeah, thank you very much.
this
That's
was
interesting.
okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, let's for example, the interaction between drug and different biomedical mechanism. So I think we can use knowledge graph to make some relation between them, and then see when it starts and when it ends, and what was the interaction between them. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So we have two questions in chat. One is how do you see the future data privacy developing?
That's a good question. Yeah, this is a question that and actually I did have a slide for that, but I ended up removing that. So I will just like keep this slide here. That's a very good question. A lot of patient data is currently stored in like secure databases and data warehouses. Similarly, and so this is just patient data that is like present in an electronic health record system, right? But there's also contextual data. So like, for example, when you are developing clinical search applications, you might want to use the user behavioral data to like predict like what the user is going to type next and things like that, or what is the user potentially looking for in the search results. So there is a lot of user behavioral data which is also private and must be stored in secure silos. One recommendation is that like knowledge graphs should not have like any kind of such like private data. So the private data should obviously be stored in like the secure silos, and there must be like methods that need to be developed that use the knowledge graph in conjunction with the data that is stored in the secure silos. And we did this, the example that I presented here before was around the opioid drug knowledge graph, right? So the opioid drug knowledge graph was developed using publicly available terminologies, UMLS terminologies, RX norm, things like that. But the data that is stored in the EMR data warehouse, that was completely separate from the knowledge graph. And what we ended up doing was use the knowledge graph in conjunction with the warehouse to develop the summarization and the visualization dashboard that you see here. There's obviously some development around like federation, a secure federation, like the policy aware federation. So one approach that I remember back in the day was like the SAFE. I forget what that acronym stood for, but it was query federation over your knowledge graph, which might be public, but also private data that is stored separately from the knowledge graph. So how do you do policy aware, secure query federation across these different sources, and use the combined results to develop in your applications?
Sure. Thank you. So we have another question from Dr. Nadeem. Do you have a question? Please ask.
Yeah, Mr. Kamdar, thank you for such a nice presentation. So my question is related about what is the difference between the knowledge graph and the graph database? With the knowledge graph, you can, in a more limited way, you can say is the representation of the knowledge in a more proper way. Then we need in a further to make any decisions, do we need some machine learning techniques and as a layer to place on the knowledge graph to make any decision? What are your thoughts about that one?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So the way I see it is the knowledge graph is not only just the graph database itself, like it's a whole ecosystem, right? Like it has like it includes like methods around like populating the knowledge, like extracting novel knowledge, integrating the knowledge from different sources, the exploration and curation interfaces, and then projections from the knowledge, like API services, querying platforms for use of that particular knowledge in the different applications. And so that I think is like what I believe, like apart from like the knowledge graph also has like ontological characteristics. It has a schema definition. It can like do like inheritance, symmetry, things like that, and the knowledge can come from several different sources. Like what I believe is that the knowledge graph is this entire ecosystem that I'm showing here. And so there are different methods which like tie in like like that play together with each other. Like so you have your machine learning and deep learning methods that extract novel knowledge and put it in your knowledge graph. But you can also have other rule-based methods, data science method, but also knowledge graph embedding methods like graph convolutional networks and concept embeddings or relation embeddings and things. So node to vec, transitional embeddings, things like that. So machine learning methods can play nicely with a knowledge graph, and that can be used in both for knowledge extraction as well as in applications. But for me, the knowledge graph is like this whole ecosystem, and that is where it's not just the graph database itself.
All right, thank you so much. So we are almost, it's 3 p.m. We have 2 more questions. Let's see if we could. So one question from Amelia. It seems like this could becoming interesting research when combined with patient demographics and public environment data. Still a lot of error, vulnerabilities, no?
So error vulnerabilities in the while working with patient data, or
yeah, I'm not sure. So let's move on to another question. So yes, when we have a large amount of data where it is difficulty to find patterns, this is where the knowledge graphs comes in place, and it must be decision making. I think this is just a comment. So well, thanks a lot. I personally learned a lot from this research, and I'm following your entire trajectory. You know, you are in Germany, and then you moved to the Stanford, and I was trying like from last 6 months to somehow could get us part, and will share your research to our faculty and students. Well, thanks again, and on the behalf of from my side and behalf of our CCPS College of Professional Studies from St. John's University, we all thanks to you and for your time. Again, you are a very busy person, and we really have honor to host you, and we will our series. Thanks.
Good. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Yeah. Have a nice.